Én amúgy sem szeretem különösebben az évfordulókat, de a mai egy különösen bűzös alkalom. 3 éve indult meg a teljes körű orosz invázió Ukrajna ellen, most pedig egyik oldalról Donald Trump egészen eszement külpolitikája, másik oldalról pedig a putyinista forrásokból dotált európai szélsőjobb kényszeríti az ukránokat egy egészen új nehézségi fokozatra.
When I came back to Kiev, I remember I felt like something is wrong. Well, what's wrong? In a week, I realized that I haven't seen any kid in Kiev since then. Unfortunately, we are losing people. We are running out of people. Me personally, I've lost about 15 friends and fellows only in the front lines that were killed by Russians. So we need peace, but we need a just peace. And a just peace for us and for Russia are different things.
Relying on the US in the next 4 years might not really be an option, right? Does it mean that Europe has to step in more? Most likely, yes. Is it easy? Most likely, no.
We cannot let what's happening in the US distract us from what is happening in Europe, especially what's happening in Ukraine. We have our own issues to deal with, and let's not get distracted from all this madness.
A középidő egy osztrák-magyar produkció, ahol európai ügyekről van szó, meg arról, hogy mire kellene jobban ügyelnie Európának. Én Paprika Kinga vagyok, a vendégeim pedig Európa minden sarkából érkeznek. 2 hetente jelentkezünk új adással, úgyhogy iratkozzatok fel a csatornán. Sajátos egy évforduló a mai. Február 24-e annak a napja, amikor magasabb fokozatra váltott egy amúgy már 8 éve tartó háború. Az ukránok ugyanis 2014 óta kérlelték Európát, hogy vegye komolyan azt az orosz agressziót, amikor a Majdan téri tüntetésekkel kirobbant méltóság forradalmára. A Kreml azzal válaszolt, hogy megszállta a Krím-félszigetet és szeparatista csoportokat támogatott a Donyeck és Luhanszk régiókban. A mai évforduló tehát egy elég önkényes dátum, de ennek ellenére rendkívüli dolgot jelöl, ahogy arra a mai egyik vendégünk Maxim Kijak rámutatott. Putyin azt hitte, hogy 3 nap alatt meghódítja Ukrajnát, de 3 év alatt és szörnyű veszteségek árán sem sikerült térdre kényszerítenie a nála jóval kisebb és szegényebb szomszédját. Ez a nemzetközi közösséget épp úgy meglepte, mint a Kremlt, és az ukránok tudják, miért harcolnak. 1991-ig ők nem csak a szovjet blokkba tartoztak, hanem a Szovjetunió részeként a magyarországinál jóval keményebb elnyomásban volt részük. Az ukrán nyelvhasználat sem volt engedélyezett egy sor hivatalos fórumon, például a felsőoktatásban. A szovjet politika őket az orosz nép integráns részének tekintette, és az önálló ukrán identitás ápolásáért nem csak Koki meg Schaller járt. A holodomor, azaz a nagy éhínség 1930 és 33 között zajlott, a halálos áldozatait 7 és 10 millió közöttire teszik. Azt sokan vitatják, hogy ez teljesen szándékos népirtás volt-e, vagy pedig a sztálinista iparosítás okozta ezt a katasztrófát csak amolyan melléktermékként. Mindenesetre Sztálin nem tett az ukránok helyzetének az enyhítéséért, és ez a csapás összezúzta az ukrán függetlenségi mozgolódásokat. Ugyanez idő alatt Kazaksztánban a népesség 40%-a halt meg, vagy hagyta el az országot az éhínség miatt. Az egykor szovjet uralta országokban sokan emlékeznek arra egészen pontosan, miért nem akarnak újra Moszkva tenyere alá kerülni. Na nem, mintha a Szovjetunió előtti cári orosz birodalom olyan kegyes lett volna például a lengyelekkel. Nem véletlen, hogy az ukrán ellenállás leghatározottabb támogatói Európában azok a balti államok, Lettország, Litvánia és ritka nyelvrokonaink az észtek, akik maguk is szovjet uralom alatt töltötték a 20. század tekintélyes részét, és pontosan emlékeznek, mi a tétje az országaik függetlenségének. A Putyin rendszer a Szovjetunió teljes jogú örökösének tekinti magát. Putyin maga egy volt KGB ügynök, aki élete tragédiájának tartja a Szovjetunió összeomlását, amit ő Kelet-Berlinben élt át fiatal ügynökként. A birodalmi fantáziáira jellemző, hogy az utóbbi 2 évtizedben az Orosz Föderáció hivatalos történelemszemlélete rehabilitálta a dicsőséges honvédő háború emlékét, azaz a szovjet részvételt a II. Világháborúban. A nácikkal való kollaborálásról, meg a felszabadító szovjet seregek által végzett mészárlásról, fosztogatásról és tömeges nemi erőszakról valahogy nem esik szó a hivatalos fórumokon, ahogyan arról sem, hogy a felszabadításból 40 évnyi proxy megszállás lett. Apróságok? A 2014-es Euromajdan forradalom pont azért tört ki, mert az ukrán népesség az Európai Unióhoz akart közeledni gazdaságilag és politikailag, a kormányzat viszont Némi presszió hatására ettől visszalépett és maradt az orosz nyomvonalon. A tömegtiltakozások félmillió embert mozgattak meg, mire a Janukovics kormány fogta magát, azt ráküldte a karhatalmat a tiltakozókra. 108 civil és 18 rendőr halt meg ezekben a zavargásokban, amiben Janukovics aztán hamar bele is bukott. Erre válaszként rohanta le Oroszország a Krím-félszigetet és szított agressziót a Donyeckben és Luhanszkban 2014-ben. Vannak elemzők, így például a magyar történész Ungvári Krisztián, akik szerint a nemzetközi közösség langyos reakciója erre a támadásra egyfajta appeasement politika volt, ami pont úgy kudarcot vallott, mint a II. Világháborút megelőző appeasement, azaz megbékélés vagy kibékítés politikája Hitlerrel szemben, amikor a nyugati hatalmak azt gondolták, hogy majd csak jól lakik a náci Németország, ha némi területi agressziót ráhagynak. Azt az is milyen szépen sikerült. Gyengék kedvére elszpoilerezem, nem sikerült szépen. De Maxim Kijek filozófus tovább megy 2014-nél egészen 2008-ig, amikor Oroszország érdemi következmények nélkül lepofozta Georgiát, régebbi nevén Grúziát. Az 1979-es afganisztáni intervenció óta ekkor először sértette meg Oroszország egy szuverén állam határait. Az 5 napig tartó háború az orosz fél részéről szörnyű pusztítással járt, de a nemzetközi közösség meglehetősen visszafogottan reagált rá. A Chatham House elemzője George McHadnisvili szerint, miután Európa szemet hunyt a grúziai orosz agresszió fölött, ezzel gyakorlatilag kikövezte az utat, amely a Krím annektálásához vezetett. Ungvári Krisztián arra is emlékeztet a magyar-orosz kapcsolatokról szóló videóesszéjében, hogy ugyanebben az évben, 2008-ban a NATO elutasította Ukrajna csatlakozási kérelmét. Orbán Viktor maga emelte ki ezt a történelmi fordulatot, mint ami meghatározta az ő külpolitikáját.
Volt egy orosz politikája Magyarországnak, illetve a mi politikai közösségünknek, aminek egy fontos határa volt 2008. 2008-ban eldőlt, hogy a nyugatiak nem akarják fölvenni a NATO-ba se a grúzokat, se az ukránokat. És akkor én megértettem, hogy itt egy teljesen más korszak jön. Egészen 2008-ig lényegében a nyugat egy térnyerésben volt, ez a NATO bővítésben is kifejeződött, és 2008-ban, amikor a bukaresti NATO csúcson az asztalon volt ez a javaslat, meg lehetett volna szavazni. Az oroszok is elég gyengék voltak még ahhoz, hogy el kellett volna fogadniuk, akkor a nyugat úgy döntött, mi úgy döntöttünk, hogy nem vesszük fel őket. Ekkor én megértettem, hogy innentől kezdve ezek az erőviszonyok lesznek hosszú ideig Európában. És akkor egy új orosz politikát építettünk föl, akkor vettem fel a kapcsolatot Putyin elnök úrral 2009 tájékán, és akkor megértettem, hogy Oroszország része lesz az európai biztonsági architektúrának, ahogy mondják, az európai biztonsági építménynek, hiszen létrejött az az új határvonal, ami elválasztja a NATO világát az oroszoktól, a kettő között pedig van egy ütköző államrendszer, délen a grúzok, itt nyugaton, nekünk keleten, az oroszoktól nyugatra pedig az ukránok. Ez az új helyzet.
Ungvári elemzését megnézhetitek a YouTube-on, link a leírásban és idefönt a kártyán. Magyarország kapcsolatát a szomszédos országokkal évszázada meghatározza az osztrák-magyar monarchia felbomlása és a trianoni békeszerződés, illetve azok a politikai irányzatok, amelyek az elcsatolt területek miatti történelmi sebeket kihasználják és nem hagyják begyógyulni. Az Ukrajnával ápolt kapcsolatunk alapköve évtizeden át az orosz gázkereskedelemtől való függés volt, amely mindkét országot kiszolgáltatta, ugyanakkor helyzetbe is hozta átadó országként. A 2010-ben hatalomra került Fidesz kormány sohasem riadt vissza az irredenta felhangok politikai kiaknázásától, és ennek megfelelően módszeresen leválasztják a határon túli magyarságot az anyaországaikról, ami politikailag és anyagilag is kiszolgáltatottá teszi ezeket a közösségeket a NER felé. Orbán közösségi média felületein rendszeresen találni olyan tartalmakat, amelyek Erdélyre, mint otthonra, mint valójában magyar területre utalnak, és ezért sokszor meggyűlik a baja a mindenkori román kormányoknak a Fidesszel. Ezért is sarkalt a keserű viccelődésre a románokat, szerbeket, és hát a többek között a vajdasági magyarokat is, amikor a szerb-magyar határon 2015-ben felhúzott pengedrót kerítéssel a Fidesz végre egyszer elismerte a trianoni határokat. Erdély és a felvidék kitüntetett szerepet játszanak a magyar irredenta fantáziákban, és jóval ritkábban látunk olyat, hogy valaki Szatmárról fantáziálna hasonlóképpen. Valójában a NER azért nem res lehajolni a többi régió potenciális szavazóiért sem, és fegyverként használni őket a magyar politikában. Ezt látjuk ma is, amikor Ukrajnával szemben egy cinikus, az agresszor Oroszországot támogató politikát folytatnak, ugyanakkor a kárpátaljai magyarokról kizárólag úgy beszélnek, mint magyarokról, és soha nem hangzik el kormányzati szájból, hogy ők amúgy ukránok és ukrán állampolgárok, egy soknyelvű, összetett ország és kultúra teljes jogú részesei, nem pedig valamiféle zárvány, amit onnan erővel ki kellene hasítani. Számos magyar nemzetiségű katona szolgál most is az ukrán oldalon, így például a kárpátaljai sárkányok néven elhíresült 101-es dandár 68-as önvédelmi területvédelmi zászló aljában, illetve a 128-as önálló hegyi rohamdandárban és a határőrségnél. Itt Ács Danit idézem a 444-ről. Magyarország az Európai Unión belül és azon kívül is nyíltan és aktívan képviseli az orosz háborús érdekeket. Oroszország legszorosabb, a szlovákon túl egyedüli uniós szövetségese minden tőle telhetőt megtett és megtesz a győzelemért és Ukrajna bukásáért. Magyarország az oroszok elleni szankciókat, ahol tudta, akadályozta. A NATO a saját katonai szövetségünk bővítését, a finn és a svéd csatlakozást, ameddig csak lehetett, gátoltuk. Ukrajna anyagi támogatását minden erőnkkel gáncsoltuk. Kirill moszkvai pátriárkát, egykori KGB ügynököt, háborús uszítót kimentettük a szankciók alól. Itthon és külföldön is nagy erőkkel terjesztettük a Kreml háborús dezinformációs anyagait, a pártsajtó folyamatosan és egyre durvábban hergel a védekező ukrán nép és Zelenszkij ellen. Az orosz propaganda, amit helyi viszonyokra lelkesen adaptál a magyar kormány és a lakály médiája is, nem tekinti Ukrajnát teljes jogú önálló országnak, hanem csak egy ütköző területnek, amelyet Oroszország és az USA között kell vagy lehet felosztani, és esetleg számíthat belőle pár cafatra a kibic karvaj Magyarország is. Az Egyesült Államok valóban Ukrajna legfontosabb nemzetközi partnere volt mostanáig, de abból korábban sem kértek, és most sem akarják, hogy a fejük felett leosszák, felosszák, szétosszák őket. Donald Trump éppen ezt az irányvonalat képviseli, így például közvetlenül egyeztet Putyinnal, anélkül, hogy az ukrán felet bevonná, pláne, hogy bármely érintett európai vagy ázsiai országot, vagy akár nemzetközi szervezetet behívná a tárgyalásba. Ezen felül előterjesztett egy olyan gazdasági egyezményt az ukránoknak, ami tulajdonképpen egy büntetőpolitika, ami egy az egyben gyarmatosítaná az ukrán gazdaságot, és nemrégiben leszítte Zelenszkij elnököt, hogy ő tehet a háborúról. Nem az orosz agresszor, aki megtámadta őket, aki birodalmi politikát folytat, hanem az ukránok, amiért megvédték magukat. J.D. Vance, Trump alelnöke nemrég egy biztonsági tanácskozáson arrogánsan leiskolázta a NATO tagokat, hogy nekik igazából magukról kellene gondoskodniuk, amin láthatóan őrjöngött az európai vezetők jó része. Zelenszkij elnök nagy energiákat fektet abba, hogy megőrizze a diplomáciai hangnemet az USA és Ukrajna közt, de ez szemmel láthatóan nehezére esik. Tulajdonképpen maffia vezérként kell kezelni a Trumpot, aki elé járulva a jó indulatát próbálja megnyerni, miközben Trump nem is titkolja, hogy imponálnak neki a Putyinhoz hasonló autoriter vezetők, és abszolút birodalmi logikában gondolkodik. Ilyen tekintetben az Egyesült Államok első szovjet-orosz párti vezetőjét látjuk hatalmon. És Zelenszkijnek nem ez az első köre Trumppal. Az első elnöksége idején Trumpli úr már megzsarolta az akkor frissen megválasztott ukrán elnököt azzal, hogy visszatartotta a beígért hadisegélyt, amiért cserébe a Biden családról követelt terhelő információkat. Trump akkori viselkedése biztos, hogy szerepet játszott az orosz háborús tervek kialakításában. Mire számíthat hát Ukrajna ebben a szorult helyzetben? Hogyan élik túl, és hogyan tartják egymásban a lelket? És mi az európai szomszédok, illetve az EU mozgástere? Mit hoz a háború 4.-12. éve? Erről beszélgetek ma két ukrán és egy amerikai megszólalóval. Maxim Kiák, a Kurász Politikai és Etnikai Tanulmányok Intézetének vezető tudósa, a filozófia doktora, a Közép-Európai Intézet igazgató helyettese. Képviselte korábban Ukrajnát az Európa Tanács Három bizottságában, és a NATO Stratcom kutatásának egyik társszerzője volt. Kutatási területe a globális biztonság, az európai integráció, a dezinformáció elleni küzdelem és, csemegeként, a vallásszociológia. Katerina Botanova, a svájci Bázelben élő ukrán kurátor, író és kultúrkritikus, a Culturescapes Biennale egyik társkurátora. 2015-ig a Kijevi Kortárs Művészeti Központ igazgatója, valamint a Koridor online magazin alapítója és főszerkesztője volt. Cikkei az Eurozin magazinban olvashatóak, az egyiket még európai sajtódíjra is jelölték, link a leírásban a forrásainkhoz és a további olvasnivalókhoz. És egy amerikai Krakóban. Adam Rijkaard, a lengyelországi New Eastern Europe, azaz Új Kelet-Európa című szaklap szerkesztője, aki hosszú évek óta foglalkozik a tágabb régió politikájának felmérésével és publikálásával. Adam a Talk Eastern Europe podcast egyik házigazdája is, ahol hetente hallgathattok híreket és elemzést Kelet-Európa és a Kaukázus politikájáról, kulturális eseményeiről, társadalmáról. Ma kivételesen minden vendég online jelentkezik be, a képminőséget elnézést kérek, de nem tudtam a galériánál fogva Budapestre rángatni mindenkit. Például, mert Maxim Kijek az ukrán hadsereg tagjaként el se hagyhatja, nem is akarná elhagyni az országot. Azért a beszélgetés megéri ezt a kis rugalmasságot. Vágjunk is bele! A teljes adást megnézhetitek az eredeti otthonában, a displayeurope.eu oldalon, 15 nyelvű felirattal, a műsort készítő Eurozin magazin YouTube csatornáján angolul, illetve az átlátszó csatornáján magyarul. Iratkozzatok fel! Hello and welcome. Thanks for taking the time. We're talking all of us remotely now so that we're not limited by physical proximity or who gets to be around the others and the recording site. Maxim, let's start with you. How do you evaluate this third year? How do you see this quote-unquote anniversary also as an institution to come back to remembrance? Because of course, it's very important, and we will talk about how much the rest of Europe and the rest of the world actually contends with what Ukraine lives through and how they take responsibility for their own part in what Ukraine goes through.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your question. Yeah, you're right. We are turning over so we will be having 3 years anniversary of the full scale. But I always say that the war has not started 3 years ago. It has started 11 years ago, since illegal annexation of Crimea, since the Donetsk-Luhansk region. Just recently, this morning, we had snow falling. And for instance, for Ukrainians, snow doesn't mean something pleasant or good like for Europeans. It means that Russia will still be bombing and shelling Ukraine and cities. We just recently had Poltava, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Odessa, bombed by Russians. Ukraine is defending Europe. Ukraine is a tourniquet, is a shield, is even a weapon against autocracies, against Russia, against this axis of evil, which is Russia, China, North Korea. But Ukraine is also a mirror, because this is the mirror where Europe can be in the future. Same might be in other capital cities of European Union. So yeah, unfortunately, we have 3 years of war already. It's not 3 days like Russians wanted it to be. They said that we're going to capture Kiev in 3 days, which never happened. I'm sure it will never happen. But Ukrainians are still hanging on. We are resilient, and Ukraine will prevail. I have no doubt about that. I remember when I came back to Kiev after 1 month. I wasn't in Kiev since the full scale has started. I was in another city. I was helping my mother, and I was also a military tactics, say, trainer for civilians. But when I came back to Kiev, I remember that I felt something. It was, I guess, end of March 2022, and I felt like something is wrong. Well, what's wrong? And then in a week, I realized that I haven't seen any kid in Kiev since then. And I remember that there were so few of people in Kiev that I wanted just to hug everyone that I saw, that I met, and said that against all odds, Ukraine will win. Unfortunately, we are losing people. We are running out of people. Me personally, I've lost about 15 friends and fellows only in the front lines that were killed by Russians. And those are only those which I know. Probably there will be more of them.
I think it gives a very interesting context to things that, as opposed to 3 days, it's been 3 years now, or the expectations of a very effective blitzkrieg were very soon shattered. But I think it's also a very thankless place to be a so-called defender of Europe. And I'm only talking from historical example, where it hasn't really been a very, how should I say, prosperous position to be in, because it gives you a lot of responsibility, and it doesn't always come with the support that you expect. But we can come back to this in a second. Katarina, I want to ask you, as a curator who works with a lot of artists and creators, and who has written a lot about culture and art in Ukraine, I wonder whether you could tell us about how Ukrainian culture is faring within the rest of Europe. We have talked about this before in a podcast episode. And what we see from the news is that Ukrainian literature and film are thriving, especially in conventional printed literature, which is not really a thing that we experience all around the world.
Interesting perspective that you're bringing in, saying that Ukrainian culture is thriving, because I would probably return this question and say, do you really think it's the Ukrainian culture is thriving, or do you think that it's just getting more attention, and by this it's becoming more visible outside of a country? And then we should maybe ask ourselves the next question: do we really need a war? This war has been waged largely against Ukrainians as a society, and what holds the society together is culture, is identity, a word very much not liked and very much tamed in Europe for various reasons, but a word which is being redefined and sort of relived within Ukraine, because it is something which really does hold society together. This is the backbone of so much celebrated resilience. What artists are doing, they are fighting on their own way. A lot of them are fighting literally on the front line. A lot of them are unfortunately gone. PEN Ukraine has a special project, a special count in memory of cultural people taken by the war, and on January 1st, their count was 153 people. And of course, it's not everybody; it's just the people that we know of. You can only imagine how many people we don't know of, unfortunately, at least at the moment, that we cannot count. So it's it's a very double-edged sword, this thriving culture, and it definitely is there. There are a lot of things that are being done. There are a lot of texts are being written, exhibition openings and theater performances in different cities of Ukraine are full with people, which also means there's a lot of need to understand what is happening with the society in the days of war, which is what culture provides. This attempt to sort of imagine unimaginable, to narrate something which you cannot possibly put in your mind. And it's great that it's there. But on the other hand, as we often say, we wish there wasn't this war, which would bring Ukrainian culture inside the society and also outside.
Now that you've brought this up, that this war has been ongoing for much longer than the rest of Europe has paid significant attention to it, let me come to Adam, because I've been listening to your podcast for a couple of years, and of course Ukraine has always been high up on the agenda, even before 2022, and New Eastern Europe has been one of the specialist publications who has consistently paid attention. Some historians have been saying that the way the rest of the world, and especially the rest of the developed world, reacted to the Russian aggression since 2014 looks like a failed appeasement strategy. How do you see this in a wider context now, especially since international politics has entered another extremely erratic phase, with the biggest military ally of Ukraine electing a president who can barely tell his feet from his hands and goes in every which way from wherever he's pushed?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you also to Maxim and Katerina for your inputs. I think it's a very important context, and I mean, it's really difficult to say if the reaction in 2014 would have been harsher, would have the full-scale invasion not happened. We know that Putin has been obsessed with Ukraine for a long time. As Maxim has already hinted, as well as Katerina, it's a war not just like territorial war. This is a war against identity. This is a war against the Ukrainian people and the existence of Ukraine. And we know that since 2014, the Ukrainians have been fighting for their role to be in the European Union and to be a part of Europe, and not to be part of some buffer zone or some space which is unknown or a kind of gray zone. So this is definitely what I think the war is about. And I would go back to 2014. I think the problem is that people weren't ready for or weren't able to understand that that this was a real conflict, and what were the roots and what were the aims of Russia and the Kremlin, particularly in this conflict. Russia had done a very good job, especially since 2000 or so, in embedding economic interests in Europe in particular, but also around the world. We saw this with gas and oil, and especially with the Nord Stream pipelines in Germany. So there were a lot of factors, I think, that were pushing some interests in Europe to try to look the other way, or not look as if what was happening in Ukraine was as serious as it was. So I mean, if we look at today's perspective, there are a lot of different things we can look at when we're talking about the third-year anniversary from a more, let's say, global international perspective. But you mentioned the new administration in the U.S. And the president who has promised to end the war within 24 hours. We're already getting to several weeks into this administration, and has not happened. And we know that he has made claims that that the U.S. is in discussions with Russia about the war. As far as I understand, these discussions are taking place without a Ukrainian representative at the table. This is a very worrying sign that there are attempts to finish this war on shaky grounds and in ways where the Ukrainians do not have an opportunity to voice their perspective, and Ukrainians may be asked, or worse, forced to accept a certain type of deal, a certain type of reality, which they've been fighting against for the last 3 or 11 years.
A műsorunk mozgatórugója a Display Europe. Ez egy új tartalommegosztó platform, ahol több tucat média ajánl cikkeket, podcastokat és videókat európai politikáról és kultúráról, ahol a portál saját nyelvi modulja segítségével 15 nyelv között is fogyaszthatsz a saját anyanyelveden. És ha ez már túl jól hangzik, hogy igaz legyen, tegyük gyorsan hozzá, hogy a Display még csak nem is él vissza a felhasználói adataiddal. Hihetetlen, nem? De igaz. displayeurope.eu. Most pedig térjünk vissza a beszélgetéshez.
The whole idea that this conflict is something to be decided between the US and Russia is not just blatantly false, but extremely offensive, I think, to Ukrainians and anybody who believes in the self-determination. My personal concern there is that we've seen the previous Trump administration trying to extort information from Zelensky in exchange for military aid. This is not a very encouraging sign, right? But of course, another important factor in this game has been the information wars and both the embedding of Russian-sponsored media and disinformation. And here I really want to come back to you, Maxim, because you have a lot to say.
I am encouraging everyone all the time, especially after the full-scale invasion, that please don't name it, don't label it Russian disinformation. Don't label it as a disinformation as such. Don't label it as a propaganda. Don't label it as a misinformation and other I would say diplomatic neutral names. Please call it lie. Just very recent example. Yesterday, Russians have bombed their own city, Suja, a building where lots of Russians were hiding. Suja is now, let's say, Ukrainian armed forces are in Suja, on Russian territory. And they just bombed this building with 80-something people inside and said, those Ukrainians have made it. And every time Russians are saying, that's are not us, we are not here, the Russians are just lying. This was just only one example. I can name plenty of other examples. Russia right now, if you remember, Soviet Union was called an empire of evil. I would call modern Russia empire of lies.
What we can definitely say about the Zelensky administration in the months preceding the full-scale bombardment is that they have been extremely cautious about their communication and basically providing evidence of themselves not being an aggressor, which sounds kind of weird, but I think it was a very conscious and very important move to persuade the rest of Europe, because the Russian propaganda or the Russian disinformation has been consistently about Ukrainians being aggressors. So I think it's important that there was a preparation in advance and a very strong consciousness about the image that that Ukraine and the Ukrainian government portrays. But then we come back to this idea of representation, and I want to ask you, Katarina, about the role of artists and creators in representing the Ukrainian cause, which on the one hand, as you also mentioned, it's a very important function of art. On the other hand, it's a very heavy mandate.
Probably first want to make a bit step back to what Adam and Maxim were saying. And again, looking at 2014 and understanding that, putting a pause on this war is just putting a pause on this war. This is not the end. As long as Russia is there in the political and social formation it's only a temporary pause. So it's of course, it's all open questions, and we're not here to resolve this, but I think it's important to remind ourselves and keep this on a public agenda. And now looking back to your question about artists, I can bring back, one of the first and unfortunately very famous artworks, which was created in the very first months of a full-scale invasion by Ukrainian artist Nikita Kadan, who basically scribbled with a big letters on the misty, kind of cloudy, sky-like canvas, "We are the prize." So this "we are the prize" is the realization which, I think Ukrainian people carry with them every day. It's never been a question to the artists, from Ukraine and in Ukraine, what they do. How do they, do they take a stand or not? Do they become political or not? I think the question whether art can and should be political is the question for the societies that are, safe and secure. And in the luxury situation of being safe and secure, you can question your relations to your society or to your country as an artist, and you can be standing against it the same way you can be anti-military if you are in the situation where you're not under threat. The moment when the society starts undergoing a major turbulence, let's put it mildly, I think this question just disappears. I mean, you do what you have to do. You're a part of this society. You're a citizen. This is your country. So you become political in whatever way you can. That's basically what Ukrainian artists are doing in different forms. And, keep it high on agenda because this war is going on. And there are also other wars, and they're also important. But, our job is to keep this one present. Is it tiring? Absolutely. Is it exhausting? Very much. But so far, I think there's no other way.
Adam, how do you see this wider international context? Now, obviously, there are the neighboring countries who are very closely affected. Do you think we're actually learning the lessons we need to be learning?
Yeah, I mean, this is I think a key question, and I mean, if I have to be blunt, I would say we're not learning the lessons that Ukraine has to offer, and the situation is not looking like it's going in the right direction. So I think it's important that we understand that. And this, I think, is kind of goes a bit to your question. Then, what is the kind of international understanding, especially of the countries? I think if you look at countries like Poland and the Baltic states, we completely understand what the threat perception is, what the threat is. We have a good perception of the threat. But the further you get away from Ukraine, you have a very different understanding of what the threat is. And if we do not see that, Russia loses this war, it's going to rebuild, replenish. And as Maxim said in the beginning, it's, the threat is not just against Ukraine. It's much, much broader. But, I think we have to understand, just how much things in the world has changed in general because of what started 3 years ago. Think about how many Ukrainians now live in Europe. I think we have somewhere between 6 or 7 million refugees. 25 to 35% of these Ukrainians do not plan to go back. 25% are undecided, and 30 or so percent would like to go back when it's safe. So that's also important to understand how much of an impact Ukrainians have on Europe, because they are here. It's going to be hard for them to return home. Some of them will not have homes to return to if these areas which are occupied do not become deoccupied. Many Ukrainians have just lost their home because the territory is no longer under Ukrainian control. So I think there's just the level of change overall, and I'm not sure if everybody understands that we have reached this point. And in fact, I think we are starting to see hints of wanting to return to the pre-2022 times, if not the pre-2013 times. And when you have people like Robert Fico in Slovakia who are openly arguing against Zelensky, and shows just the level of confusion that we have in our international politics, disinformation, which is at a level unseen before, and it's starting to become effective. And we see that also with just the decrease in support for Ukraine, the increase of support for some sort of deal just to end the conflict, as well as the growth of far-right politics and those who are openly supporting the Russian side, as I had just mentioned with the Slovakian case.
Thank you. Yeah, the situation is very bleak, and again, we're at this point where the far right is very actively making inroads with the claimant of the Soviet legacy. So while Russia is restoring and rehabilitating even Stalin, and especially Stalinist cultural politics and political gains, they are financing sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, a lot of the European far right, who are more than happily in bed with them, which I think is a nice proof of something that many of us have suspected for a long time, that this is way less about ideology and more about opportunity. And of course, I'm speaking from a country where my prime minister has been rubbing against Putin as hard as humanly possible for many years.
What is like a really, I think, substantial impact of the Trump administration is the cutting of the USAID funding for civil society and NGOs. I mean, first you have Ukraine, of course. So much of civil society is supported, and its economy is supported by USAID. And by freezing that or ending it altogether, that's going to have a huge impact just on Ukraine. But by cutting also support to international civil society and pulling that out, it's going to have a huge impact, because you will have this gap, which is going to be filled in by these far-right groups, which are some of them openly funded by Russia or some other shady types of organizations. So it's going to just push them into, I think, an even stronger position.
So Katerina said about negotiations. I agree that, or I would even add for myself, that negotiations and peace for Russians and for Ukraine are pretty different things. For Russia is just a pause and for becoming stronger, better, and then to keep on ruining Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian statehood, and so on. So this will be only a pause for Russia. So we need peace, but we need a just peace. And a just peace for us and for Russia are different things. This is a tricky question, actually, and this is what Trump is not aware of. So Trump thinks that Putin is a trustful leader. He's not. Putin is an ex-KGB agent. Ukraine is only a step towards other countries, for Russia, for Moldova, for Baltic states, probably for Poland, and so on.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is really important. Also, I'm morally obliged to mention that Hungary and Serbia don't feel that Russia is a threat to them, because they're already in the bag voluntarily. So they're just like, whatever, we're already on this bandwagon. And I have to say that the majority of the population aren't happy about this. I am, however, very happy to see what's happening in Serbia right now with these mass protests and very strong determination. And I'm pretty sure that Vučić's foreign politics is part of the package that people are so fed up with, and has been for a long time.
We also want to thank Eurzine, the magazine presenting this show. Eurzine is a network of over 100 cultural journals from all over Europe, with its own podcast called Gagarin. There you can find our latest interview with Per Nyholm, a Danish journalist who has been to Ukraine multiple times over the last 3 years. The writer of this talk show, Daniela Univaso, interviewed Per Listen to it if you want to know more about war front reporting, how a journalist comes about, and what he sees ahead for Ukraine. On the program of Gagarin, you find link in the show notes. And now back to the program.
To come back to something that Adam has brought up, and that's the support and the sustaining of NGOs, cultural institutions. Katarina, this is very much your turf. And these are the people that you have been supporting and working with for a long, long time. How do you see Ukrainian civil society and cultural institutions faring in the, let's say, coming couple years?
Relying on the US in the next 4 years might not really be an option, right? Does it mean that Europe has to step in more? Most likely, yes. Is it easy? Most likely, no. But, as Ukrainians say in many situations, sometimes there is no other way, because whether we like it or not, many things about this war and many things about not just the military side of it, but also the resilience of the society and the way the society can function or should function, is a money issue. The Ukrainian economy is working to sustain the front line. Ukrainian informal economy, meaning endless volunteer initiatives that raise money for everything you can only imagine. If Europe doesn't step in, many things, or maybe all the things, will just sooner or later, but they will crumble. The cultural part of this story, of course, it is an important part of the story, because in the discussions within the Ukrainian society, but also with the discussions with the various foreign, also European, partners, funders, of course, there's this question, okay, what is more important? Immediate relief, humanitarian support, military aid, or support for, cultural institutions and cultural initiatives? And it's getting harder and harder to argue, but I also think it's more and more important to argue that sometimes it's not really a choice, because you can sustain certain burning primary needs, but does it mean that it will help the society to stand together within this war? If that starts to crumble, what do you do then? But something which holds this together is culture in different forms, not just arts, right? But in the wider meaning of culture. And that also needs support, because of course that's it's also people, it's also institutions, it's also cultural heritage, which is a separate long talk. We can start it and will never end, which is a lot of it is already lost forever, will never be recovered. A lot of it is being stolen by Russia, but a lot of cultural heritage is still there, and it needs support. It needs restoration. It needs sometimes relocation into safer grounds. It needs digitalization. There are people working on it that need support. It has to come from somewhere, and Europe has to pull itself together, also as an entity, as a European Union, and different partners, different countries individually, if Europe wants to also survive and not be swollen by the war at large.
Sometimes things must happen. Sometimes things must be done, not out of convenience. And I feel like I may be wrong, or I may be pinning it on the wrong culprit, but I do very much feel like that the sort of consumerist convenience culture that very much reaches into politics, that very much reaches into especially electoral politics and media politics for certain, it doesn't really help in these situations, because we are not primed for solidarity. We are not primed for adjusting our own circumstances. We are primed for individual, very narrow viewpoints. And I'm extremely worried about this kind of calculus basically having a huge round of success across Europe with the rise of the far right.
I have two thoughts on that. One, more immediate, is that with Trump in the US and seeing all the chaos and unpredictability, uncertainty that comes with it, that may have some sort of reverse effect in Europe. Maybe this is me being optimistic, but I think this trend of far-right parties and ones who are softer on Russia, if not openly pro-Russian, it still is right now in Europe. And even after, we can look at Romania. It was shown, the evidence that there was international interference and malign influence in the presidential election which was canceled by the Constitutional Court because of that. We see now the support for Georgescu grow, and him and a lot of those around him are very much, if not openly pro-Russian, they are definitely on the far right side and not openly pro-Ukrainian. So there is this trend, and I think what we see in Austria now, and obviously Hungary is way ahead of everybody else, but Slovakia is pulling in that direction. Poland has elections this year for presidential elections, and the candidate on the right side, the Law and Justice, not to mention the far-right Confederation candidates, are openly also critical of support for Ukraine. So I do have a lot of fears, and then I think it's next year is France, and not to mention what's of course Germany. We can't forget about Germany, which may actually end up with a stronger position towards Ukraine, and this is what Europe actually needs, and that the other European countries can help along with that. I think Brussels as such, like Brussels itself, the European Commission, they know what's at stake. So I think, if we can get real progress in Ukraine's accession to the EU, and Brussels can stay the course, and we see this maybe a kind of rejection of far-right politics in Europe starting to show up, maybe there is some room for hope.
Mentioning culture, I think another crucial thing worth mentioning is how Ukrainians are dealing with aggression, how they're using humor, for instance. So humor is a really good tool against aggression. And I can speak about it for many, many hours. I would say that this is a kind of medicine against everything that's happening right now in Ukraine, against all those bombings and shellings. So this is another topic which can be also touched upon. Not just since 2022, but also since 2014. Humor is a great tool. I would say this is probably the best tool to secure own information space. Not to mention, it's probably one of the best tools to reach a Russian audience, for instance. Sometimes it really works.
I'm often reminded that there are these sort of regional superpowers of humor, and especially political humor. Ukraine has traditionally been one. Bosnia in the Balkans has traditionally been one, and I think for their survival and struggle through the Yugoslav wars, may Ukraine's be way shorter, has been a very important factor. I'm very glad that you brought this up, that the humor and the cultural attitudes that you survived this with matter so much.
Otherwise, we're gonna, lose our minds without jokes, without humor. So
I would want to wish or dream that the attention and interest to Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history does not end with the war, or doesn't stay only war connected. That actually the changes that very slowly started to happen in the last years, when in the eyes of European cultural consumer, but also European cultural institutions, European academia, when Ukraine started to slowly kind of crawl from under the big Russian or big Soviet or big post-Soviet umbrella, that this doesn't stop, because Ukrainian culture didn't start with the war. It's not going to end with the war, and Ukrainian history neither. And this exercising of interest and respect in something which was neglected and overlooked for so many years is also an important emancipatory step to see also the whole region, which is not just the post-Soviet. It's a very rich and interesting and a complex region with different cultures, with different histories, with different contemporary cultural production, which is largely unseen and largely overshadowed by Russia one way or another. Because I think it's also an important thing for Europe itself to recognize its own blind spot, but also recognize the richness and varieties of different voices and cultures to the east or the southeast, or to the Caucasus, or even to the Central Asia. There are fantastic things happening.
And especially when Western Europeans are talking about missing the passion in Europe, well, just ask your neighbors. They still have it. Don't worry. All the convenience that has made us a little bit lame. I think we can just open the window and look out for a second.
The Ukrainians they are fighting for their own survival, obviously, but the banner, the EU flag, is also flying in Kyiv. And look at what's happening in Georgia, and the Georgians who are protesting their government, which has announced that pausing its EU integration, they are, on the streets with EU flags. So I think, like the response to those in Europe who are like, oh, the European project is like, where is it at, or is it even have a point? I think there are plenty of people out there who do believe, that their future is in Europe, and they are fighting under the European flag. And I think we forget about that maybe too much or too often. But I think we cannot let what's happening in the US distract us from what is happening in Europe, especially what's happening in Ukraine. And the news cycle and social media is like taking all of our attention away from what's happening in Ukraine and just covering this chaos and this madness which is happening. And we have to, take a breath and look at our own backyards and our own selves and in the mirror and say, listen, we have our own issues to deal with, and let's not get distracted from all this madness. And I think, we cannot forget this is, as we are here on the occasion of the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale invasion, we cannot forget like what price has already been paid by Ukrainians, and what we still can do to try to make this a better situation. I think there's a bit of hopelessness, too much hopelessness around Europe especially, and kind of this helplessness as well. And I think, if we look real hard, I think we can find that we have plenty of agency, and that, the Ukrainian example is just showing us that if you fight for what you believe in, you can really achieve something. So I think we have to try to take that lesson for ourselves as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for taking the time to talk with me today.
Te mire számítasz? Hogyan alakul Ukrajna 4. éve? Trump megkaparítja és üdülőövezetet csinál a Kárpátokból? Vagy felszívja magát az EU, hogy kipótolja azt, amit az USA megvont Ukrajnától? És mit gondolsz, milyen külpolitikát kellene Magyarországnak folytatnia ebben a helyzetben? Írd meg nekünk a kommentben, és küld el a műsort a putyinista szomszédodnak, meg a Trump rajongó bácsikádnak, és iratkozz fel a csatornára. Ez a műsor az Eurozin és a Display Europe produkciója. Médiapartnereink a bécsi Októ TV és Magyarországon az Átlátszó. Ez a talkshow az Európai Unió Kreatív Európa programja és az Európai Kulturális Alapítvány társfinanszírozásával készült. Fontos, hogy az itt kifejtett nézetek és vélemények a megszólalók és a szerzők sajátja, és nem feltétlenül tükrözik az Európai Unió vagy az Európai Oktatási és Kulturális Végrehajtó Ügynökség véleményét. Sem az Európai Unió, sem az EACEA nem tehető felelőssé értük, mintha bánnánk, ha megfogadják a tanácsainkat.